Chapter 2. It was the 16th of October, 1799, when Eugène de Beauharnais arrived in Paris on his return from the Egyptian expedition, and it was immediately after his arrival that I had the happiness of entering into his service. Monsieur Eugène was then 21 years of age, and I will not defer the recital of some details that I believe to be little known concerning his life before his mother's marriage with General Bonaparte. This reader is aware that his father was one of the victims of the Revolution. After the Marquis de Beauharnais perished on the scaffold, his widow, whose property had been confiscated, finding herself reduced to a condition bordering on poverty, and fearing lest her son, although still very young, might also be prosecuted on account of his noble birth, placed him in a carpenter's shop on the Rue de Chelles. A lady of my acquaintance who lived on that street has often seen him pass by carrying a board on his shoulder. It was a good ways from there to the command of the regiment of consular guides, and above all to the viceroyalty of Italy. I learned by hearing Eugène himself relate it the singular circumstances by which he occasioned the first interview of his mother with his stepfather, Eugène being at the time only 14 or 15 years old, having been informed that General Bonaparte had become possessor of the sword of the Marquis de Beauharnais, ventured to call on him, a proceeding that obtained complete success. The general received him graciously, and Eugène said he came to ask whether he would not be so kind as to return to him his father's sword. His face, his manner, his frank request were all pleasing to Bonaparte, who instantly restored the sword he asked for. Hardly had he taken it in his hands than he covered it with tears and kisses, and that was so natural an air that Bonaparte was enchanted. On learning how the general had received her son, Madame de Beauharnais thought it her duty to call and thank him. Josephine having greatly pleased Bonaparte at this first interview, he returned her visit. They frequently saw each other, and everybody knows how, by one thing after another, she became the first empress of the French, and I can affirm, in conformity with many proofs, which I afterwards obtained, to the fact that Bonaparte never ceased to love Eugène as much as he could have loved his own son. Eugène's qualities were both amiable and solid. His features were not handsome, and yet his countenance prepossessed one in his favor. His figure was well shaped, and yet his appearance was not distinguished on account of a habit of slouching in his gait. He was about 5 feet and 3 or 4 inches tall. He was kind, gay, amiable, full of spirit, lively, and generous. And one may say that his open, candid physiognomy was truly the mirror of his soul. How many services did he not render during the course of his life, and that, too, at the period when he was obliged to impose privations on himself in order to do so? We shall see presently why I passed only 1 month with Eugène, but I remember that during this brief period, while scrupulously fulfilling his duties towards his mother and his stepfather, he was very much addicted to the pleasures so natural to his age and in his position. One of the things which pleased him most was to give breakfasts to his friends. Hence he gave them very often, and that for my part amused me greatly on account of the comical scenes of which I was the spectator, in addition to the young military men belonging to Bonaparte's staff, who were his most punctual guests. He had, among other habitual visitors, Thiamet, the ventriloquist, Dazincourt, and Michel of the Théâtre Français, and several other persons whose name just now escape me. As may be easily believed, these reunions were extremely gay. The young officers, especially, who had returned, like Eugène, from Egypt, sought for nothing but how to compensate themselves for the recent privations they had had to endure. At this epoch, hoaxes were all the fashion in Paris. Their practitioners were brought to reunions, and Thiamet held a very distinguished rank among them. I recollected one day at a breakfast of Eugène's, Thiamet called several of those present by their names by imitating the voices of their servants, as if these voices came from outside, while he remained quietly in his place and seemed never to move his lips except for the purpose of eating and drinking. Two functions, which he fulfilled very well. Each of the officers called in this way went downstairs and found nobody. Then Tia May, assuming a faint politeness, went down with them under pretense of assisting in their search and prolonged their embarrassment by making them continue to hear voices they knew. Most of them laughed heartily at a pleasantry of which they were the victims. But there was one who, being rather duller than his comrades, took the thing seriously and was going to be angry when Eugène avowed that he had headed the conspiracy. I recall another amusing scene, the two heroes of which were the same Tia May, of whom I have just spoken, and Dugazon. Several foreigners were assembled in Eugène's apartment. The roles were distributed and learned in advance, and the two victims designated. When they were all seated at table, Dugazon, pretending to be a stutterer, addressed some remark to Tia May, who, having a similar role, replied by stuttering also. Then each of the two pretended to believe that the other was mocking at him, and there ensued a quarrel of stutterers, who the angrier they grew, the harder they found it to express themselves. Tia May, who besides playing the stutterer, had also assumed the character of a deaf man, turning to his neighbor, his ear trumpet at his ear, and asked, "What is he saying?" Nothing, responded the officious neighbor, who wanted to prevent a quarrel and take his stutterer's side. Yes, he is mocking at me. Then the quarrel grew more lively. They were about to come to blows, and each of the two stutterers had seized a carafe to throw at his antagonist's head, when a copious immersion from the water contained in the carafes made their officious neighbors comprehend the danger of attempts at conciliation. The two stutterers, however, continued shouting like deaf men until the last drop of water was spilled, and I remember that Eugène, who was the author of this plot, was in fits of laughter all the time it lasted. People dried themselves, and all was presently arranged, glasses in hand. Eugène, whenever he got up a joke of this kind, never failed to relate it to his mother, and sometimes even to his stepfather, who were greatly amused by it. Josephine especially. I had been leading a rather joyous life for a month with Eugène when Lefebvre, the valet whom he had left ill at Cairo, came back cured and asked to have his place again. Eugène, whom I suited better on account of my youth and activity, proposed that he should enter his mother's household, calling his attention to the fact that he would be much more tranquil there. But Lefebvre, who was extremely attached to his master, went to find Madame Bonaparte and displayed all his chagrin at Eugène's resolution. Josephine promised to take his part. She consoled him, assured him that she would talk to her son, said she would see that he returned to his former post, and that it would be I that she would take into her service. Josephine did, in fact, speak to her son, as she had promised Lefebvre to do, and one morning Eugène announced to me in the kindest terms my change of domicile. "Constant," said he, "I am very sorry for the circumstance which obliges us to part, but as you know, Lefebvre followed me to Egypt. He is an old servant. I cannot avoid taking him back. Moreover, you are not going to become a stranger to me. You are going to my mother's house, where you'll be very well off, and there we shall often see each other. Go there for me this very morning. I have spoken to her about you. It is an understood thing. She expects you." As may be believed, I lost no time in presenting myself at Madame Bonaparte's house. Knowing that she was at Malmaison, I went there at once and was received by Madame Bonaparte with a kindness that filled me with gratitude, not knowing that she showed this kindness to everybody, and that it was as inseparable from her character as grace was from her person. I had very little to do. My time was almost entirely at my own disposal. I profited by it by making frequent excursions to Paris. Hence the life I led was very pleasant for a young man who could not yet suspect that sometimes afterwards it would become as constrained as it was free. Before quitting a service which I had found so agreeable, I will relate some facts belonging to that period which my position near the stepson of General Bonaparte allowed me to become acquainted with. Monsieur de Bourrienne has perfectly recounted the events of 18th Brumaire in his memoirs. The account he has given of that famous day is as exact as it is interesting, and all who are curious to know the secret causes which bring about political changes will find them faithfully exposed in the narrative of the Minister of State. I am very far from pretending to excite an interest of this nature, but the reading of Monsieur de Bourrienne's work has set me also on the track of my souvenirs. There are circumstances he may not have known, or may even have omitted voluntarily as being of small importance, and what he has let fall upon the road I esteem myself fortunate to be able to gather up. I was still with Monsieur Eugène de Beauharnais when General Bonaparte overthrew the Directory, but I was just as much in the way of learning all that passed as if I had been in the service of Madame Bonaparte or the general himself, for my master, although very young, had the full confidence of his stepfather, and above all that of his mother, who consulted him on every occasion. Several days before the 18th Brumaire, Monsieur Eugène ordered me to busy myself with the preparations for a breakfast he was to give on the very day to his friends. The number of the guests, who were all military men, was much larger than usual. The repast was made very lively by an officer who undertook to caricature the manners and deportment of the directors and some of their trusty adherents. To personate Director Barras, he draped himself a la grecque with a tablecloth, took off his black cravat, turned down his shirt collar, and advanced with many airs and graces, resting his left arm on the shoulder of the youngest of his comrades, and pretending to chuck him under the chin with his right hand. There was not a soul present who did not comprehend the meaning of this sort of charade, and it was greeted with shouts of laughter that seemed as if they would never end. Afterwards, he personated the Abbé Sieyès by passing an enormous rabbi of paper through his necktie, elongating indefinitely a pallid visage, and then prancing several times around the room astride on his chair, ending at last in a grand somersault, as if his horse had thrown him. To comprehend the meaning of this pantomime, it must be known that the Abbé Sieyès had been taking riding lessons for some time in the Luxembourg Garden, to the great amusement of the promenaders who assembled in crowds to enjoy the stiff and awkward appearance of the new horseman. When breakfast was over, Monsieur Eugène repaired to General Bonaparte, whose aide-de-camp he was, and his friends rejoined their several corps. I followed them out, for certain remarks that had just been made in the rooms of my young master made me suspect that something serious and interesting was about to happen. Monsieur Eugène had agreed to meet his comrades at Pont-Tournant. I went there and found a considerable assemblage of mounted officers in uniform, all in readiness to follow General Bonaparte to Saint-Cloud. The commanders of all arms had been requested by General Bonaparte to give breakfast to their official corps, and they had done the same thing as my young master, and yet not all the officers, even the generals, were in on the secret, and General Murat himself rushed into the hall of the 500 at the head of his grenadiers. So the only matter in dispute was a dispensation as to age, which General Bonaparte was about to ask in order to obtain a place as director. I have learned from a sure source that at the moment when General Juppé, who was devoted to General Bonaparte, was assembling in the court of the Luxembourg the Directory's guard, of which he was the commander, the worthy Monsieur Gouillet, president of the Directory, put his head out of the window and shouted to Juppé, "Citizen General, what are you doing here? Citizen President, you see well enough what I am doing. I am assembling the guard." "No doubt I see that very well, Citizen General. But what are you assembling them for?" "Citizen President, I'm going to make an inspection of them and to command a great maneuver. Forward march!" And the Citizen General started at the head of his troops to go and rejoin General Bonaparte at Saint-Cloud, while the latter was expected at the house of the Citizen President, who waited for him in vain at the breakfast to which he had invited him. General Marmont had also breakfasted. The officers of the army he commanded, I think it was the artillery. At the end of the repast, he had made a few remarks persuading them not to separate their cause from that of the conqueror of Italy, and to accompany him to St. Cloud. But how do you want us to follow him? Exclaimed one of the guests. We have no horses. If that is all that hinders you, said the general, you will find some in the court of this hotel. I have kept all those of the National Riding School. Let us go down and mount. All the officers present accepted this invitation, excepting General Alex, who declared that he would not be mixed up in any squabble. I was at St. Cloud on the 18th and 19th Brumaire. I saw General Bonaparte harangue the soldiers and read them the decree appointing him commander-in-chief of all the troops in Paris throughout the whole extent of the 17th Military Division. I saw him in the first place come out very much agitated from the Council of Ancients and afterwards from the Assembly of the 500. I saw Monsieur Lucien let out of the hall where this assembly was sitting by some grenadiers sent to protect him from the violence of his colleagues. Pale and furious, he sprang upon a horse and galloped straight to the troops to harangue them. At the moment when he turned his sword towards the breast of General, his brother, saying that he would be the first to immolate him if he dared to make an assault on liberty. Long cries of "Long live Bonaparte! Down with the lawyers!" broke out on all sides, and the soldiers, led by General Murat, rushed into the hall of the 500. Everybody knows what happened there, and I will not enter into details, which have been recounted so many times. The general, on becoming first consul, installed himself at the Luxembourg. At this time, he also inhabited Malmaison, but he was often on the road, and so was Josephine, for her journeys to Paris when they occupied this residence were very frequent, not simply for government affairs, which often necessitated the presence of the first consul, but also to go to the play, which General Bonaparte was very fond of, always giving the preference to the Théâtre Français and the Italian opera. This is a passing observation merely, and I intend to reserve until later on the facts I have collected concerning the tastes and familiar habits of the emperor. Malmaison, at the time of which I am speaking, was a place of delights, where no one was ever seen to arrive without expression of satisfaction, and everywhere I went I also heard blessings invoked on the first consul and Madame Bonaparte. In Madame Bonaparte's salon there was not as yet the shadow of that rigid etiquette which it was afterwards necessary to observe at St. Cloud. The Tuileries and all the palaces where the emperor might find himself, society there displayed a simple elegance alike removed from republican grossness and the luxury of the empire. Monsieur de Talleyrand was at this period one of the most assiduous visitors at Malmaison. He sometimes dined there, but it was more usual for him to come in the evening between 8 and 9 o'clock and return at 1 or 2, and occasionally at 3 in the morning. Everybody was admitted at the house of Madame Bonaparte on the footing of equality, which pleased her very much. Murat, Duroc, Berthier, and all the persons who have since figured as great dignitaries and sometimes with crowns in the annals of the empire came there familiarly. General Bonaparte's family was likewise very attentive, but we knew very well amongst ourselves that they did not like Madame Bonaparte. I acquired proofs of this afterwards. Mademoiselle Hortense never quitted her mother, and they loved each other very much. Besides the men distinguished by their functions in the government and the army, there came also some who were not less so by their personal merit, who had been so by their birth before the Revolution. It was a veritable magic lantern in which we could see the personages defiling before our eyes, and this spectacle, without recalling the gaiety of Eugene's breakfasts, was far from devoid of attractions. Among the persons whom we saw most frequently, I must mention Monsieur de Volney, Monsieur Denon, Monsieur Le Mercier, Prince de la Poix, Messieurs L'Aigle, Charles Baudin, Charles Bernonville, Monsieur Isabey, and a large number of other men celebrated in science, literature, and art. In fine, the majority of those who formed the Society of Malmaison de Montesson. Madame Bonaparte and Mademoiselle often went out into the country on horseback. The most constant equerries on these occasions were usually Prince de Poix and Messieurs L'Aigle. One day, as one of these cavalcades was re-entering the court of Malmaison, Madame Mademoiselle Hortense's horse became frightened and ran away. Mademoiselle Hortense, who sat a horse perfectly and who was very agile, attempted to spring off on the grass beside the road, but the fastening which kept the bottom of her riding habit under her foot prevented her from extricating herself quickly enough so that she was upset and dragged along by her horse for several feet. Happily, the gentlemen who accompanied her, having seen her fall, had sprung off their horses and arrived in time to pick her up. By an extraordinary piece of good luck, she had received no contusion and was the first to laugh at her mishap. During the earliest period of my sojourn at Malmaison, the first consul always occupied the same bed with his wife, like an honest citizen of Paris, and I never heard a single gallant intrigue that took place in the chateau. This society, the majority of whose members were young, were often very numerous, frequently gave themselves up to exercises which reminded one of college recreations. Indeed, one of the great diversions of the inhabitants of Malmaison was to play prisoner's base. It was after dinner, usually, that Bonaparte, Messieurs Lauriston, Didelot, and Lucet, de Bourrienne, Eugène Rapp, Isabelle, Madame Bonaparte, and Mademoiselle Hortense divided themselves into two camps, where the prisoners made and exchanged reminded the first consul of the great game to which he gave the preference. The most agile runners in these games of prisoners' base were Monsieur Eugène, Monsieur Isabelle, and Mademoiselle Hortense. As to General Bonaparte, he often fell down, but he picked himself up again with shouts of laughter. General Bonaparte and his family seemed to enjoy an unusual happiness, especially while they were at Malmaison. This habitation, in spite of the pleasures enjoyed there, was far from resembling what it has been since. The property comprised a chateau, which General Bonaparte found in a rather bad condition on his return from Egypt, a park which was already very pretty, and a farm, the yearly income from which certainly did not exceed 12,000 francs. Josephine herself superintended all the works executed there, and never has any woman been endowed with such taste. From the commencement, they acted plays at Malmaison. This was a kind of recreation which the first consul liked greatly, but he never took any part except that of spectator. All who formed part of the household were present at the representations, and I will not conceal the pleasures we enjoyed, more perhaps than any of the others, in seeing the persons in whose service we were thus travestied on stage. The Malmaison troupe, if I may be permitted thus to designate the actors of so exalted a social position, was composed principally of Monsieur Eugène, Jerome, Lauriston, de Bourrienne, Isabelle, de Leroy, Didelot, Mademoiselle Hortense, Madame Caroline Murat, and Demoiselles Auguet, one of whom afterwards married Marshal Ney, and the other Monsieur de Broc. All four were very young and charming, and few Parisian theaters could have brought together such pretty actresses. Moreover, they were very graceful on the stage and played their parts with real talent. They behaved there much as they did in the salon, where they had an air of exquisite delicacy. The repertory was not greatly varied at first, but it was usually very well selected. The first representation at which I was present was composed of the Barbier de Seville, in which Monsieur Isabelle played the role of Figaro, and Mademoiselle Hortense that of Rosine, and the de P. Amoureux. In other times, I saw the Gueguer Imprévu and the Faust Consultations presented. Mademoiselle Hortense and Monsieur Eugène played perfectly in this latter piece, and I yet remember vividly how, in the part of Madame Leblanc, Mademoiselle Hortense seemed prettier than ever in her old woman's costume. Monsieur Eugène represented Monsieur Lenoir, and Monsieur Lauriston the charlatan. The first consul, as I have said, confined himself to the role of spectator, but he appeared to take the most lively pleasure in this private and, one might say, family theater. He laughed, he applauded heartily, but also he often criticized. Madame Bonaparte was equally amused, and even if she had not been proud of the success of her children, the first subjects of the troop. The fact that this was a relaxation agreeable to her husband would have been enough to make her seem pleased with it, for it was her constant study to contribute to the happiness of the great man who had united his destiny to hers. When a day had been set for a representation, there was never no performance, but there was often a change of place, not on account of the indisposition or an actress's headache, as happens in Parisian theaters, but for much more serious motives. It often happened that Monsieur Udaletta would be ordered to his regiment, that an important mission would be entrusted to Count Almaviva, but Figaro and Rosina always remained faithful at their post, and the desire to please the first consul was, moreover, so general among who surrounded him that the substitute manifested the utmost goodwill in the absence of the principals in their department, and the play never failed through default of an actor. Chapter 3. I had not been long in Madame Bonaparte's service when I made the acquaintance of Monsieur Gervais, the doorkeeper of Malmaison. My connection with this excellent man became more intimate daily, so much so that in the end he gave me one of his daughters in marriage. I was eager to learn from him all that referred to Madame Bonaparte and the first consul before I entered the household, and in our frequent interviews he took the greatest pleasure in satisfying my curiosity. It is to his confidences that I owe the following details concerning the mother and the daughter. When General Bonaparte set off for Egypt, Madame Bonaparte accompanied him as far as Toulon, she having desired very much to follow him to Egypt, and when the general made objections, she reminded him that, being a Creole by birth, the warmth of the climate would be favorable rather than dangerous to her, and that by a singular coincidence, it was on the Pomona that she wished to make the voyage, that is, on the same vessel that had brought her in her early youth from Martinique to France. General Bonaparte, having finally acceded to his wife's wishes, promised to send her the Pomona, and persuaded her to go meanwhile and take the waters of Plombières. Things were settled in this way between the husband and wife, and Madame Bonaparte was enchanted to go to Plombières, which she had long desired to do, knowing, like everybody else, what was the special reputation of these waters? Madame Bonaparte had been at Plombières but a short time, when one morning, as she was in her salon, hemming bandana handkerchiefs and chatting with some ladies, Madame de Combes, who was on the balcony, called her to come in and see a pretty little dog that was passing the street. All present ran out after Madame Bonaparte, and the balcony gave way with a frightful crash. Fortunately, one may say, by a great chance nobody was killed, but Madame de Combes had her thigh broken, and Madame Bonaparte was cruelly bruised, although no bones were fractured. Monsieur Gervais, who was in a room over the salon, ran down on hearing the noise, and had a sheep killed and skinned immediately, and Madame Bonaparte enveloped in the skin. She was long time in regaining her health. Her arms and hands especially were so bruised that for some time she was unable to use them, and that it was necessary to cut up her food and put it in her mouth, and in a word to render her every service ordinarily required by a child.